We all know that in frontier history, many people's stories get whitewashed, particularly the stories of African Americans and Native Americans. Many of them either get absorbed into the tales or are just barely touched upon in history. But there was another group that you may not have heard about, whose stories were outright erased from history altogether. And they are a combination of both Black and Native Americans. Enter the Black Seminoles, aka the Afro-Seminoles. These weren't just marginalized men and women, but freedom fighters who took the U.S. government to negotiations their way. If you've never heard of them, that's understandable. They're yet another part of U.S. history that has been whitewashed from the public mind. But before we tell the stories of the Black Seminoles, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. Your support helps us tell the untold tales of the frontier. Who were the Black Seminoles? Before we discuss the Black Seminoles, it's important to discuss the indigenous group with whom they share their name, the Seminoles. While similar in name, they are a different group of people with different stories, which is important for us to tell. Before the European settlers arrived, Florida was home to many different indigenous cultures. When the settlers arrived, they brought not only colonization, but also disease, which wiped out a majority of the tribes. So much so that by the early 1800s, Florida was almost empty of any Native American tribes and was instead under the Spanish crown, calling itself La Florida, with only two areas inhabited by Spanish people, St. Augustine and Pensacola. However, things changed when, north of La Florida, the colonists began their conflicts with many tribes. Many of these tribes came from Muskogee Creek, moving into the Panhandle in order to escape further fighting. Some stood and fought, but others knew that the best course of action was to run. Over the upcoming decades, the Yuchi, Yamasee, Creeks, and many other tribes began fleeing to Florida. Many of these people migrated towards many of the upper creeks and other areas, encroaching even towards the province of Carolina. They already had land thanks to the Spanish crown, which had given land to the lower creeks. Their goal? Create a buffer between them and the English settlers in the Carolinas and Georgia. Along with these tribes, we also saw the Choctaw, native to western Florida, the Chickasaw that left Georgia due to conflicts, and others slowly filled into Florida as a place to escape. To these tribes, it was a new beginning, a reprieve from the growing threat of colonization. They called themselves the Seminoles, which has many meanings, but the most prominent one is outcast. Soon, they were able to stand on their own 2 feet, with the Seminoles becoming more independent of the other Creek groups in the area. They even created a thriving trade network by the late 1700s and early 1800s. They also were able to expand considerably because of the lack of tribes or inhabitants on these lands, which remained uninhabited for hundreds of years due to the effects the Spanish conquerors caused. By 1822, the Seminoles had over 5,000 members. Even after the Spanish surrendered to Britain in 1763, the land they gave the runaways was still a sanctuary to those fleeing persecution. But it wasn't just Native American tribes who fled. In the American colonies, some Africans did not become slaves, but fled south as far as they could. They went south until they found other people who did not look exactly like them, but looked a lot different than the colonizers. They assimilated with the tribes, often through capture and purchase. However, to the Black refugees, life under the Seminoles was much more manageable than the white settlers, with the Seminoles also protecting them from slave hunters who wanted them back to colonial lands. While the Seminoles did not let most Black people become members, some managed to become Seminoles, and there were even marriages and children between both races. And thus, the Black Seminoles were born. During the 1820s, at least 800 Black people were living with the Seminoles, and despite some of them facing marginalization, their lives were much better under this new living situation. George McCall, a U.S. Army lieutenant, visited a Black Seminole community in 1826 and said the following: "We found these Negroes in possession of large fields of the finest land, producing large crops of corn, beans, melons, pumpkins, and other esculent vegetables. I saw, while riding along the borders of the ponds, fine rice growing, and in the village, large corn cribs were filled, while the houses were larger and more comfortable than those of the Native Americans themselves. General McCall could have been exaggerating to tell a story and an agenda, but there was no doubt that the Black Seminoles were living well. For some settlers, Florida at this time would have been swampy, disease-filled, and unlivable. But for the Gullah people of African Americans who lived just up north, it wasn't much different than home. Many of the Black Seminoles lived near many of the Native American Seminoles. They were allowed to live independently and even had the right to bear arms. As a mixture of cultures, including African, Seminole, European, Caribbean, and Mexican, they are a melting pot, fitting for an area that calls themselves the outcasts. Tell me, do you remember reading this in history class? In the early 1800s, black people lived independently and had access to plenty of food. Probably not, but it's true. This tribe had a combination of three cultures. They had their African roots, their white upbringing, and their Native American companionship. One might think that it didn't work out, but somehow the groups managed to come together and overcome hardships that came their way. Despite their struggles, they crafted a home in Florida. But as you know, Florida is no longer a territory, but a place we go to for vacationing. The settlers would soon come knocking. But the Black Seminoles were ready. Their roles in helping the Seminoles. With any conflict comes a compromise before it. During compromise times, Black Seminoles were a valuable ally for the Native Seminoles for several reasons. First, their knowledge of English. Many Black Seminoles came from or were slaves who learned English through the white settlers. Should a white settler negotiate with the tribe, a Black Seminole could be their spokesperson. Sometimes they could act as a guide for the colonists, introducing them to this brand new world. Other times, they acted as a mediator, the fine line between a successful negotiation and further tensions. The black people and Seminoles also had a mutually beneficial relationship. The Seminoles provided sanctuary and strategy, while the black people, meanwhile, provided sustenance, offering crops and livestock as a tribute. It worked out, and there was mutual respect for them. However, that wasn't the only reason the Black Seminoles were so valuable. They were not just smooth talkers. When negotiations went south, they could put up one hell of a fight. But sometimes, the fights did not require force, but espionage. Being part of two worlds, the Black Seminoles were perfect for spying. Many of them had to use espionage tactics to escape slavery and slave hunters, which again translated to fighting effectively should conflicts arise. These traits were already showing even during times of relative peace. They used these traits to keep their territory and live a peaceful life in Florida. But soon, the war would start. The Seminole Wars. It was the early 1800s. The USA was freshly free from the UK's control, and it was looking to expand and get back what it believed was its own. A certain general turned president was looking to finish what he started. Also during this, many American slaveholders, shortly after winning independence, were worried about the armed black communities growing in Florida. These people knew how to fight, and since they did bear arms, it proved to be a challenge for these people. Many U.S. slaveholders looked to capture and return these black fugitives, using the Treaty of New York as grounds for their actions. The First Seminole War was led by General Andrew Jackson, who invaded Florida when the Spanish still oversaw it. Jackson's goal was to disrupt the Maroon communities in Florida, so he attacked the Negro Fort, a prominent black Seminole stronghold the British allowed them to occupy. However, there was a history of conflict before that. During the War of 1812, the Seminoles and Black Seminoles knew the phrase, "the enemy of my enemies, my friend." They were allies with the British and fought several battles against the raids from Georgia. These attacks could be brutal. Jackson worked to break up these Maroon communities, being his primary objective. Edmund P. Gaines, directed by Jackson, was to destroy this fort to cripple the slaves and the Seminoles. However, he later delegated this to Duncan L. Clinch. In 1816, for example, the garrison was attacked. U.S. soldiers destroyed it, and 270 people died. A year later, the soldiers attacked Foultown, a Seminole village, and the Seminoles countered by attacking a reinforcement boat. 43 people died, many of whom were women and children. Over 400 Maroon and Seminole establishments were also burned, with their food supplies destroyed, and many of the horses and cattle also taken. While the Seminoles and Black Seminoles fought hard, they could not withstand an army that resisted an entire nation. The communities tried to move into the South along with Central Florida. Both African Americans and Native Americans lost their homes and villages during this time. Pensacola, once a Spanish settlement, was quickly captured. In 1821, the Spanish ceded Florida, and it was now a part of the USA, with Andrew Jackson becoming the territorial governor shortly after. His first order of business was to attack Black Seminoles and any other free blacks that lived near Tampa Bay. The Black Seminoles did fight back, but many knew it was a fruitless effort. Many of the Black Seminoles eventually left to the Bahamas when it was clear they were not able to find sanctuary in Florida anymore. Accounts mentioned that some managed to migrate in 1821, with a larger group picked up by 27 sloops and canoes near the islands. Those that managed to make it to Andros in the Bahamas are still alive today. In 1829, Jackson became the 7th president of the U.S., and he was ready to rock the boat once again. He wanted to drive the Seminoles west into uncharted territory so the U.S. could expand into Florida. And so he passed an act that had a horrible, horrible name. He enacted the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Indian removal. It almost seemed like these tribes were nothing but termites that needed to be removed from a person's home. And to the U.S. government, it might as well have been that way. They thought they had settled, but they had to move before they could truly stretch out their legs. Once again, the Black Seminoles and Seminoles took to arms. However, the U.S. Army had a cunning strategy: divide and conquer. Enter General Thomas Sidney Jessup. In 1838, he tried to turn the Allies into rival factions by making an offer. If the Black Seminoles surrendered, they would be offered freedom. Jessup had had difficulties fighting with the Black Seminoles. He even once said, "This is a Negro war, not an Indian war." Now, these tribes usually knew better than to trust the colonizers. The colonizers' offers were infamous for being a one-way street. The tribes would do everything they asked, and they would get only punishment in return. However, this was a different situation. Despite Jessup's frustrations, many in the Black Seminoles were beaten down too. When Jessup made his final offer, many Black Seminoles surrendered out of hope that this nightmare would end. One individual who surrendered was a warrior known as John Horse. John Horse, or Gopher John, was a warrior who fought back against his oppressors as much as possible, rising from a translator of the tribes to a lower-level war chief. He was a strong negotiator, and when negotiations didn't work, his guerrilla tactics helped the tribes resist, as much as they could. By 1838, John Horse had lost his wife and many of his comrades. Broken down by many losses, he surrendered to the troops under the condition that he would be offered freedom. Another person during this time was Wild Cat. Wild Cat, or Kokuchi, was a chieftain of the Seminole tribe and fought during the latter stages of the Second Seminole War. During the late stages, the U.S. Army was going scorched earth on the tribes. See a village? Destroy it. See a Seminole? Capture and send to Indian Territory, or if they were in a bad mood, kill them. This was a far cry from how it was in the beginning, back when Wildcat was a young man. The Seminoles had managed to get the upper hand, ambushing and killing over 106 U.S. troops. The tribe was front-page news, literally in this case. Soon, Wildcat became the chief after his father, Imathla, was captured and imprisoned at Fort Moultrie, located in South Carolina. After that, Wildcat came not only with his tribe, but also with cats of a different color, the Black Seminoles. At one point, Wildcat was captured after promised negotiations with Thomas S. Jessup turned into him and his tribe being imprisoned. They came in peace, and when the U.S. Army saw that, they took advantage. However, Wildcat and his companions escaped, and in a clever way, by fasting until they were thin enough to slide between the bars of their cells. But no matter how clever Wildcat was, he was soon cornered, and he surrendered. Not just him, however, but both Seminoles and Black Seminoles. Not only did they send the Seminoles from their homes, but the Black Seminoles as well. For many in these tribes, this was a fate worse than death, with Wildcat saying, "I was in hopes I would be killed in battle, but a bullet never reached me." The Trail of Tears and Mexico. While the story of the Black Seminoles is more obscured in history nowadays, the Trail of Tears is something you may be familiar with. Those who weren't ethnically cleansed were forced to go to the new Indian Territory, located west of the Mississippi River. Over 60,000 members were members of the 5 civilized tribes: Cherokee, Muskogee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and of course, Seminoles. 1,200 miles of disease, harsh conditions, and disease. It's estimated that as many as 6,000 or 10% of the people who walked that trail died. In modern times, a drive from Florida to Oklahoma can feel like a chore. Now, imagine if you had to walk in the open air. Despite the horror, some had hope. Could this settlement be the end of their journey? Could they settle down unbothered by settlers? However, there was infighting as soon as things settled. The U.S. government had placed Black people and Seminoles under the Creek Nation's administration. The Creek Nation was a lot different than the other tribes. They had not resisted the white man, but embraced them, including their views on slavery. As for John Horse, he survived the trail and set up villages near Seminole settlements. He knew that his tribe would be safe near his Seminole brothers and sisters. However, they were defenseless. Not only were the Creek settlers wanting to enslave him, but the government turned its back on them. Some members of the Federal Army wanted to keep the peace and protect the members of the Black Seminole tribe. However, they soon bent the knee to lobbyists who had one agenda: slavery. The Army was now there not to protect them, but to disarm them, to let them become prey to the predator Creeks. They had just settled, but now it was time to go again. And John Horse would make things right. John Horse, along with nearly 200 Black Seminoles, escaped from the Indian Territory in 1849. If the U.S. didn't care for them, the only solution was to flee to another country. And the Promised Land wasn't further west. It was south. At this point, Mexico had abolished slavery. 20 years ago, as a matter of fact. That's another thing you may not have heard in the history books, and you may have believed the USA was the first nation to abolish it. When they arrived, they weren't greeted with violence, but a warm embrace. The government let the Seminoles settle at El Nacimiento under one condition: they would help defend the northern Mexico border. But even though they had left the USA like a bad ex, the U.S. government still treated them like a jilted ex and still pursued the tribes. However, the Mexican government remained true to its word, empowering and not emasculating these tribesmen. They and the Black Seminoles fought back, and this group of Black Seminoles became known as the Mascots. Some returned to the U.S. after slavery was abolished. Others succumbed to the disease in the new country. But those who stayed managed to carve out a settlement and are still in Mexico to this day. They still celebrate their cultural heritage and even have a Juneteenth celebration known as Dia de los Negros, or Day of the Blacks. But what about the Black Seminoles who stayed in the Indian Territory? The end of slavery in the USA. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, ending slavery in the U.S. as we knew it. But it wasn't quite over for the Black Seminoles. They weren't living in the U.S., but in U.S. territory. And during the Civil War, many of the tribes had picked a side, but it wasn't one that you may have thought. Many of the tribes, including the Seminoles, supported the Confederacy. Some did it for more selfish reasons, such as wanting to own slaves. However, others did it for more sympathetic reasons. For some, the Confederacy was fighting against the government that had oppressed them for so long. The Confederates had also promised to grant independence to the Indian Territory. Whether they would have upheld that promise is reserved for alternative history channels, but many of the tribes trusted them. So when the Union won, many in the Indian Territory responded not with applause, but with jeers. It came to a point where the U.S. had to step in and free the Black Seminoles and any other black people living with these tribes. They could become full citizens of these Indian territories or go back to the U.S. as free men. Some stayed, and they still live in Wewoka, Oklahoma, today in the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. While the worst was over, many of the Black Seminoles still struggled, however, including John Horse. John Horse faced land disputes, capture, and other harassment well into his elder years. We could, and probably will, make a video about him at some point. Even in his 70s, a time when he should be enjoying his twilight years, landowners were trying to take his reserved land. He needed the government's help to tell those landowners that, yes, this land belonged to him. And so he set out for Mexico City. Yet he did not arrive. No one knows what happened to John Horse. Logically, he most likely perished during the trip due to his old age. No one ever found a body. For all we know, maybe Horse found some land away from the prying eyes of his enemies and lived the rest of his life there. Let's also talk about what happened to Wild Cat. He also found himself in Mexico, and he lived the rest of his life in a community he established. In 1857, he died of smallpox. In the end, it wasn't the settlers that did him in, but the diseases brought by them. Those who decided to move outside the territory found freedom, but also new challenges. States like Oklahoma may have outlawed slavery, but they made it as difficult for them to live as possible. This not only applies to the state government, but also to the Seminole Nation. In fact, it wasn't until 1954 that the freedmen were included in the Seminole Nation's Constitution. It has been just over 70 years since then, and some in this tribe are still alive today to remember when this law was written. Some Black Seminoles found themselves in Texas. Many of them came from Mexico and were recruited by the Army to be scouts. The Black Seminole Scouts. They would play an essential part in the Texas Indian Wars. They were skilled at tracking, enduring attacks, and thinking creatively about tactics. 4 of the Black Seminoles, in fact, were even awarded a Medal of Honor for their fight against the Comanche. The irony is that the U.S. Army tried to get rid of them due to their tactics, which stymied them from claiming more land. But now the Army was using its knowledge to secure Texas. And to this day, you can see their mark in Texas history. There's even an event, Seminole Days, where the descendants visit Brackettville, Texas, to celebrate their heritage and meet other Black Seminoles. Finally, some Black Seminoles still live in Florida, the place where their Black Seminole heritage started. For example, 50 Black Seminoles live on the Fort Pierce Reservation, and some black people may lack Seminoles and not even know it. In fact, if you have a good amount of Seminole blood, you are allowed to join the Florida tribe and be a part of the small yet proud Black Seminoles. And some have, and those who have now feel at home. These tribes struggled, and many would agree that they were dirty. However, it seems that for now, peace and familiarity have finally come at the cost of many lives. The Black Seminoles are a tribe that's lesser known in the history books, but one that should fascinate us. They were a combination of several different worlds and lifestyles: the warrior spirit of the African tribes, the so-called civilized nature of living with the colonizers, and the independence that came with living in other tribes in an unfamiliar land. They had an unbreakable spirit, and this is due mainly to the tribals and tribulations the Black Seminoles had to deal with. They suffered not only at the hands of the government, but also had to face other tribes, some of whom wanted to keep them as slaves. Life was never easy for many of them, as they were forced out of their homes multiple times and forced to live a life of constant prejudice and pain. Despite all of this, they still stood tall, and while their stories are not told by the history books, their descendants and little corners of history still remember them. Keeping their stories alive tells many the tales of these brave and fearsome spirits. Hopefully, as more learn about these people and the hardships they faced, respect can be given, and understanding will follow. Did you know the tales of the Black Seminoles? Or was this new to you? Let us know in the comments. If you liked this video, be sure to give us a like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. There's a lot of history that was kept out of the history books, not just against the Native American tribes, but offshoots of them, and we hope to tell as many tales as possible.